You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, brought to you by NES Design and Construction and hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I'm joined by Travers for a conversation about trans kids. Thank you for joining the podcast. Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Hi, Nicola. Great to be here. My name is Travers. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University and trans non-binary.
Wonderful. I'm curious to know how early you have noticed people becoming aware of their gender. I think this is a question that people ask, or at least they ask me a lot as a trans person. They want to know, when did you first know that you were trans? So in your experience dealing with trans kids and maybe from your own personal experiences, when does that sort of begin?
The youngest reported assertion of a gender identity that was inconsistent, about 2. There are 2 of the parents I interviewed. Their kids at around the age of 2, 2.5, were really clear that,
Right.
like, I remember, one parent reporting to me that their daughter, when they were 2.5, said, "I is a girl." And, I've interviewed several parents who reported this. In my own situation, like when I was 4 or 5, probably 4, like, the whole girl thing just didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I think for me, I was about 5 when I realized that. It was whatever age you are in kindergarten, because I remember that becoming something that became talked about. We started gaining this understanding of what it meant to be a girl or a boy. And in what ways are the experiences of trans and non-binary kids today similar or different, do you think, from your own experiences with gender growing up? Obviously, times have changed and conversations are changing.
I wouldn't dare say it out loud, you
Mm,
know, like, through my childhood, teenage years, and, a huge chunk of my adulthood, I wouldn't even say it out loud. Like, it was just so unthinkable.
right. And was that like a fear of how people around you would react?
Oh, yeah, and also, I mean, just so much of my own self-hatred, but, oh my god, I just couldn't really get down with being a girl, although when I came out as queer, being a dyke worked for me for a really long time.
Hmm.
That gave me a different gender identity,
Interesting. Okay.
and there's so many masculine women, like, in the lesbian community, so it created that opening, and it worked for me for a really long time.
Do you know if that's the case for other people who have since maybe transitioned or changed their gender identity, where they've found that sense of community within a different label in the past like that?
Probably about 15 years ago, I wrote an article about trans inclusion in lesbian softball leagues. I wrote 2, one about policy and the other, the one that I co-authored, so I interviewed trans people who played in lesbian softball leagues, and, certainly several of the trans men said that it worked for them for a while, but,
Hmm.
and one of the reasons they wanted to stay in the lesbian softball league is because they'd found their people there.
Right.
And didn't want to have to leave when they transitioned to male. But, I think that for a long time, like, being a dyke was sort of like that was all that was available. And it did, I think for many of us, it did work. And for some people, it still works. But, when other possibilities started to emerge and, trans visibility increased, it made a real difference. I mean, part of like, doing the research that I did on trans kids brought me into conferences like Gender Odyssey in Seattle that is like a combination of, adult trans people events and families of trans kids events,
Hmm.
and it was in those spaces that I, finally allowed myself to acknowledge how much I wanted to start tea.
Right. And can you recall that first time that you genuinely felt seen for who you were and what maybe we can learn from that as it relates to supporting trans kids now?
I've certainly felt relatively seen in my adult life, but, I didn't stop using female pronouns or my dead name until during the pandemic. It gave me that space to sort of do it online so that by the time I showed up in person, people had gotten over it.
It's interesting that the pandemic had that effect where you could explore gender in a way where you didn't have to do it quite as openly or publicly as maybe you would have had to at another period of time. And maybe that explains why a lot of people seemingly found their awakening during that time period.
It sure helped, but things were happening for me before then, actually, now I remember, and there's a bit of a funny story. I think in, like, well, probably around 2019 or something, I got into riding electric unicycles, which is, there aren't that many of us around. But one of the things I discovered, like, I discovered there were some people in Vancouver who rode electric unicycles, but also there are these communities of people, like, all over the United States and even all over the world where they ride electric unicycles. And I was like, what the heck? This is so weird. But I went to a conference in San Diego, I think it was 2019, and I reached out to a Facebook group in San Diego to say that I was coming, and one of the guys lent me his wheel. And so the arrangement was, because I was gonna go on a group ride with them. Like, I was at San Diego for a conference, but, I was gonna go on a group ride with these folks, which was really cool. And for a while on Facebook, I managed to change my name to Travers.
Hmm.
And then Facebook had, come back and said, "You can't do that. That doesn't seem like your real name." And I don't know, just sort of on a whim, I put Dan Travers because it rhymed with my dead name. And when I showed up in the parking lot, all these people knew me as Dan Travers,
Mm.
not as my female name. And I almost corrected them. And then I went, "Oh my God, this is happening. I can do this."
Hmm.
And so to this day, in the electric unicycle communities, also on Facebook, like, I am Dan Travers. So I go downtown to Evie's, which is a store that sells electric unicycles and electric scooters and those kinds of things. And, it's like, "Hey, Dan, how are you?" And, like, even when I turned 60, I did, Dan Travers' 60th birthday ride, and, like, 200 people came out. So it's sort of funny, and this was, I remember, like, this San Diego ride, at the end of it, one of the guys who was there said, "Well, this is the first woman that we've had on a ride." And I said, "I'm actually trans non-binary." And they said, "Well, we've checked that box too." And it was like, and then, like, the next year, I think it's still pandemic, I went on the Southern California electric unicycle tour, and, oh my god, like, there were a few women. I wasn't the only trans person, but I was the only trans masculine person. There were a couple of trans women, one of whom wasn't out. But, like, some of these people were Trumpers, and it was like, these were guys.
Mm.
And it was weird, but I pulled it off. Like, it was possible, like, for me to participate in this event with, like, over 200 people and go on these different rides. And it was just like, I'm sure they were like, "Oh, okay." Like, there was some confusion and I had to
Hmm.
explain, but it was workable.
Right. That's amazing. Unfortunately, it seems like that's more challenging these days to make connections with the US, more because of the trade war, I guess, than because of the electric unicycle community not being accepting. But I want to sort of switch gears a little bit into the parental and child relationship, and parents often worry about getting it wrong when it comes to raising children. So, what can families do to ensure a supportive, loving, and safe environment for a child who's exploring their gender?
Well, I think the first thing that they should, like, this is what I really want the message to be, is that all parents should try to create so much more space around gender for their kids. And I did it with my kids, and it was so hard. Like, I had to work so hard and I wasn't successful. My son came home at 3 years of age, and he'd been wearing pink socks. I said, "Alex says these are girl socks." And I said, "They're not girl
Mhm.
socks. They're pretty. You can wear pretty things." But he never, ever wore them again, you
Mm.
know? And he was just sort of copying his older sister. Like, sometimes he'd wear dresses. And, I just wanted them to wear what they wanted to wear and like what they liked. I found it really annoying, when people would say, "Oh, he's got a girlfriend. Isn't that cute?" If he was hanging out with like a girl a girl toddler.
Right.
It's just so crushing, this endless instruction that there are only two sexes and this is what you are and this is what this means. And I did a lot of educating of daycare workers and everywhere I went, just because it was so problematic for me.
Hmm.
I just wanted, like, leave the kids alone, but, it's really difficult. But when, as a parent, if your kid, lets you know that their gender identity is something other than what you assumed it would be, believe them,
Right.
believe them and find out what they need in terms of support, because some kids, they want you to advocate for them and others don't.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's sad to hear that that's still something that kids are struggling with. I think that that's very similar to my own experience of being told that things that I was wearing or the way that I was acting was too girly, and it caused me to sort of swing that other direction of trying to be hyper masculine when that wasn't who I was. And it really prevents people from being able to live authentically. It stunts their ability to, discover who they are and maybe transition if that's the route that they're wanting to go or that fits with them. And you talked about how there was this idea of sort of following in the footsteps of his bigger sister and wanting to, I guess, present himself in dresses or pink socks because of that influence, maybe. And in that sense, how do siblings and peers influence a trans kid's self confidence? And how do you think adults can help to foster healthy friendships or healthy relationships between siblings?
Um, like, I think, first of all, it's like, my son never thought of himself as a girl. He just thought a dress was as an item of clothing that he could choose to wear, which
Hmm.
is what I wanted for, like, all my kids, like, wear what you want to wear. But I think that just encouraging everyone in a family to create, as much space around gender for everybody as possible is a healthy way to go. And then if, a member of your family at any age lets you know that they're trans, that or they, identify as non-binary or they need a different pronoun, that, you just get on with it. It doesn't really need to be a big deal. It's like people who want us to disappear are making it a big deal. But really, the number one factor that determines whether or not a trans kid will do well is family acceptance and support.
Right.
And I know that, you know, some parents are afraid of what the world will be like for their kids who are gender nonconforming and trans. And, maybe thinking, am I actually doing my kid a favor by supporting them? But yeah, they are. Because
Right.
the harm of, a kid hiding. And, just as a parent myself, like, I made the decision really, really early that I would never be the one to gender police my children. Like, even if I thought that, they were gonna get teased or something like that, it's like, I wasn't gonna do it. Like,
Hmm.
I was gonna support them in, however they presented their gender. And, I just wasn't gonna be that person to say, people might give you a hard time about this. They didn't need to hear that from me. They just needed me to, be absolutely supportive.
Hmm. And in terms of fostering that support, I mean, you work in the education field. Is that a huge component of how that comes about? Is educating people around what it means to be trans or to have a different gender expression?
Yeah. I mean, when I published my book in 2018, The Trans Generation, I did so much media work. And I still do a lot of media work. I also speak to school boards. I, was invited to present at grand rounds at the University of Manitoba Medical School. I was on the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of the BC Soccer Association. And, my main message is to create environments that are more supportive of trans kids by creating environments that aren't organized on the basis of gender. Like, one of my big messages to adults is, whether you know it or not, if you work with children, you work with trans kids. And every time you organize children into gender-based categories, you're putting kids in crisis, although you don't know it, because, the majority of trans kids are invisible. Like, they get it. Like, the message is really clear. This is not a safe place to be. But if you stop organizing kids on the basis of gender, you at least create space for those invisible trans kids where they're not in crisis and they feel like there's a way to live in the world that isn't restricted by the sex that is assigned them at birth. Even those small things, we know from studies of resilience in childhood that all it takes is for, one adult, whether it's a bus driver or, a teacher at school, to see and respect a kid, to like give them enough to keep them going. Um,
Hmm.
and I think often we do that for kids without knowing it, that we're doing it.
And we also know that the opposite is true, right? Where if people grow up in an environment where they're not feeling accepted, then rates of self-harm, for instance, are going to rise. And there's so many benefits to raising kids in an environment where they do feel supported, whether that feels uncomfortable, I suppose, to the parents or teachers or the people around them, or not. I don't know why it's a foreign concept that bullying causes people to not like their lives, but that's essentially what it boils down to, right? And when it comes to that school environment and making sure that that's a safe and accepting place, from pronouns to bathrooms to sports, what does a truly welcoming school look like and feel like to a trans kid?
It would be a school that was not organized on the basis of gender.
Hmm.
But it would be more than that because trans kids are part of every population. So for a school to be, a supportive place for trans kids to go, it would have to be a place where anti-racism was like a serious project where, all the vulnerable kids in the community are supported. I mean, like when I wrote my book, one of my key audiences was parents of trans kids. And, you know, I I really marveled at and acknowledged the role of white, cisgender, heterosexual appearing women in engineering change for trans kids in schools, because they're a demographic that can do work that, men can't do, queer and trans people have less success doing. But, you get these like white heterosexual moms advocating for their trans kids, and you can make a lot of change. But what I wanted was that they advocate on behalf of all trans kids. So that
Mm,
means trans kids who are indigenous, who are immigrants, who are racialized, who are hungry, who are living in poverty. Like, if we take care of all kids really well, then we're gonna be taking better care of trans kids. And then specifically, be an affirming place that kids get to determine their own genders, they get to say what pronouns they wanna use, even if it changes, because kids need a place to experiment and explore. So, people get anxious, "Well, what if he changes his mind?" It's like, "Okay, he changes his mind."
right.
Like,
And
"Okay."
hmm.
Right. Like, let's make it, like exploration for everyone, like, because, one of my arguments is if we make trans kids safer, we're going to make all kids safer. I mean, there have been studies that show that schools with GSAs and anti-homophobia policies, they actually create better environments for girls and young women because you're reducing the gender polarization. So you're dealing with less misogyny.
Hmm.
And I also think it's important to note that when you're crushing trans kids' sense of, self-expression, you're also, you're traumatizing them, and we know that traumatized kids bully. Like, I
Hmm.
think my own, participation in, bullying other kids and reinforcing hierarchies because you're just terrified that you're gonna be on the bottom,
Hmm.
and it's like the meanness and the way that we uh, judge other kids and like it's like everybody participates in this really negative hierarchy, system of hierarchy. And I don't think kids start off wanting to do that.
Right. That's more of a learned behavior.
Yeah, it's a coping mechanism because like I remember the feeling of relief that somebody else was the target and not me because I'd had like I've had experiences in school where, like I was like gender policed and, considered not to be an appropriate kind of child. And so, it was always a relief when someone else was the target.
Right. And I guess that can push someone to say, well, I'm just going to direct that over to someone else as opposed to let's just end this.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
And it sounds also like this is a conversation that comes up quite a lot on this podcast. Intersectionality is the key to solving any of these issues, where you can't just say, we need to support trans kids. You have to say, we need to be anti-racist, anti-ableist, all of these things in order to support all marginalized people, including trans kids. And I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that idea of changing your mind later. And it's kind of a non-issue. But I think there gets to a point, and this is typically where people start to have more of an issue with that concept of changing your mind, is when permanent changes occur, whether it's to an adult or a child. And that then brings us into a conversation around gender affirming care. So, gender affirming care for minors is pretty regularly discussed these days. There's a lot of misinformation around it. And I'm curious to know what misunderstandings you think people have and how we can address those misunderstandings.
Well, I think that the anti-trans forces that are mobilizing, against us purposefully say things like, we're going to ban surgery on trans kids.
Hmm.
Like there's this idea that 10-year-olds are saying I'm trans and, we're whisking them off. Like, it's completely unrealistic. It's really, really hard to, I mean, surgery, certainly bottom surgery is unavailable for minors,
Hmm.
and top surgery is really rare. And if it is, it's like at 16 or 17. So there's this, propaganda that, kids are having treatment that is permanently altering their bodies. But I think people really don't understand that more people regret knee surgeries than trans surgeries. Like the regret rate is very, very low. And if you don't give trans kids who need it access to affirming healthcare early, then you are subjecting them to the development of secondary sex characteristics that are a lot harder to address, like, in
Hmm.
adulthood. But part of the reason that I think that trans kids are being targeted, I mean, the main reason that trans people are being targeted is because hate is an effective mobilizing force, for conservative politicians, which is really gross and really true. But I really think that part of the reason that they're making it so hard for trans kids to access hormone blockers is that they want to know who we are.
Hmm.
This relatively brief period of like maybe 15 years where, there started to be some access to affirming care for trans kids. In a lot of ways, that feels like it's ending. It's certainly ending in the United States. It's ended in the United Kingdom. It's still possible in Canada, but not in Alberta. But I do believe that there's this anxiety among conservative folks that trans people are among us and we don't know who they are.
Hmm.
Like the ability to have access to hormone blockers, and then like for those who really want it, like they're much better able to pass.
Hmm. Well, and the reason that I support gender affirming care for minors is because of my own personal experiences, and I think about how difficult it is to transition as an adult. All of the things you're trying to essentially reverse all of these effects that have been caused by this puberty that you never really wanted to go through in the first place. And there's surgeries that are become more complicated, and you've had to live with these aspects of your body for longer than maybe you felt comfortable with, and that's a huge struggle that some people don't make it through. Those are all the reasons I support gender affirming care. It's why I support SOGI education for children. But when you're talking to a conservative, none of that seems to matter to them because they want to dehumanize us. They don't view us as people that are deserving of having treatment that makes our lives easier. So I try to think about how do I reach that demographic, and one of the ways that I've been thinking of is a lot of conservatives like to view themselves as fiscally responsible. Well, when you treat kids as an adult, it's significantly more expensive than treating them as a kid because you can address so many of those issues before those secondary sex characteristics get developed, as you said. Do you think that that's a good way to address that point, or are there other ways that you can think of to try to convince a conservative person that gender affirming care for minors is something that's important?
The cost analysis, it's so tragically ignored because we know that providing, really meaningful support to vulnerable parents of children down the line will reduce the costs of hospitals, prisons, those kinds of things. So it doesn't seem to be that effective. One of the things that, I do to sort of focus my efforts is I don't try to convince conservative people to change their minds.
Mhm.
My target audience, I do a lot of media work, I do a lot of public education. My target audience is the people in the middle who aren't really educated about trans issues, but could be. And I
Mhm.
like to think that the media that I did around, when my book came out in 2018, I like to think that, maybe I inoculated some people
Mhm.
against anti-trans hatred. So that's my target audience. And I'm also like in this particular moment, the anti-trans rhetoric and policy making is at such a fever pitch. Like it's not a good time to try to convince people otherwise because they're too polarized. I
Mhm.
feel like right now my advice to parents of trans kids, because I've been doing webinars for parents of trans kids in the United States and Canada, and you can imagine they're completely freaking out.
Mhm.
And they feel like, I mean, I'm talking with parents of trans kids in Texas and Florida, like in places where they literally fear that, their kid is in danger. And, I've said like for some of you, like hiding may be necessary for a while, but not at home. Like your kid needs to know you support them and believe in them. But one of the things I'm saying is that like, in these like places where anti-trans rhetoric and policy is at a fever pitch, the thing to do is to get yourself into local governance
Mhm.
and not championing trans kids in particular at all, but rather to put yourself in a position to advocate for all vulnerable children. Because, like I'm hopeful that this like heightened anti-trans policymaking and rhetoric will sort of lose momentum.
Mhm.
When it loses momentum and, there's more space to push for trans kids again, you're already in a position where parents of other vulnerable children have seen you care about their kids.
Right.
And if you want people to care about your kids, the most effective way to do it is to start by caring about theirs. And there are so many vulnerable kids. So, like, get on your library boards, get on your school boards, and just advocate for vulnerable kids in general. And this will give you a platform that is more powerful. And also,
Mm.
like it, for many trans kids, it's really dangerous right now if their parents are openly advocating for them. Like
Right.
like they have to balance that, but, if you have the capacity to get into local governance, do it.
Mhm.
Well,
Well,
that's what the Christian right I mean, the Christian right took 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade, and they never stopped trying to do it,
mhm.
you know? So even when they were, like, failing, getting their like, when they failed to keep same-sex marriage out, they failed, like, they like, now they're winning again, as Donald Trump would say, so much winning, but, we have to do the same thing. We have to keep working at it and trust that, our work will ultimately pay off.
Right. Well, and I mean, that's smart political strategizing where you can't just appeal to a very small base. You're never going to get elected if you try to do that. And also, at the same time, you're going to have people saying, we shouldn't be ignoring this group of people in order to get elected. And I mean, that's something I run into all the time. I run for a party that's, stands a very small chance of getting elected. And I put myself out there knowing that there's a very slim chance I'm going to get elected. But that's always the conversation is how do you reach more people, and does it make sense to stop talking about this important issue in order to reach those people? And we talk about the movable middle, right? You've mentioned that you're trying to reach those people who are in the middle, and that's always a struggle as well because you have to think, are there enough people in that segment and can you reach enough of them to sway politics one way or the other? So there's a lot of conversations that I think are going to be really difficult for people who are very much in that headspace of we cannot stop talking about this specific issue. We have to, put all of our energy into it because that's not necessarily the way to be effective in politics. What would you say to someone who's sort of in that mindset?
Well, I don't mean that we should stop talking about it. But
Well, I'm not saying that specifically, but in terms of like, we can't just focus on trans kids. We have to talk about marginalized kids more generally.
absolutely. But I
Hmm.
mean, that's just like like I said, like I want the privileged parents of trans kids who buy my book and take their kids to LGBT and trans camps and all those kinds of things. I want them to look out for all trans kids, which means that, like trans kids are in every population. So
Hmm.
maybe you're not giving them the opportunity to determine their own gender because that's not possible right now, but you're making sure they've had something to eat.
Right.
Like advocating for trans kids is more complicated than, gender self-determination. And I do think in some places, like some parts of the United States, it may be really unsafe to advocate for trans kids,
Right.
like really overtly. So what I'm saying is put yourself in position to when things die down a bit. That's not what I'm doing right now. Like I'm advocating for trans kids like all the time.
Right.
But for me, that advocacy means, like, school lunches, like, like, safe and affordable housing, like, food security, all those kinds of things.
Hmm. Like, be pragmatic, but keep your kids safe. Do what you can. Build that support for the future. I hope that we can get there at some point. And is there maybe a movement that people can get involved in where they can feel as though they're working as like a group effort? Because I think if everyone has different goals and they're all trying to work towards those different goals, sometimes that can also complicate matters where people are butting heads when it comes to certain ways of approaching whether it's advocacy or politics or whatever that might be. Are there sort of some group efforts that you're seeing that people can get involved in?
Well, I think people should get involved in local government,
Hmm.
as much as possible, and it's not for everybody. I mean, it's not for everybody, but I do think that getting involved in local government, like being part of your school's pack, even though, like sometimes it's gonna you just you just get in there and position yourself to have some influence
Hmm.
forward. I mean, like the Christian right has done this work. Like they have had soldiers on the ground getting into local governance and doing this work. So, I think we need to do the same and we need to have long-term goals. I've taken so much inspiration from prison abolitionists, and I'm thinking specifically of Mariama Kaba, who published some of her essays, some of which were co-written, and the book is called We Do This Till We Free Us.
Hmm.
And one of her central contributions is that hope is a discipline. Meaning, it's not something you feel or don't, you have to cultivate it.
Hmm.
And secondly, that we need to have a really long timeline so that we don't feel that, we succeed or fail today. That, she says, we don't know what kinds of increased freedom and justice our actions today might result in for other people, but we have to believe that it will.
Right. Well, and I think one of the reasons that, as you mentioned, with conservatives being sort of a very organized group that pushes for things and sticks with it and accomplishes these goals, we need to do the same thing, obviously. But a lot of the way that they do that is by overlooking certain important issues. Like the conservative movement will often overlook some pretty horrendous things in order to achieve their goal, which we're trying to strike that balance maybe on the left of saying we're not willing to overlook certain things, but at the same time we still need to have this joint effort. And I think more than ever that's becoming apparent as we see hundreds of pieces of legislation throughout Canada, UK, and obviously the US targeting trans youth more than ever before. So I'm curious to know how we push back against that in a unified way that doesn't overlook really horrendous issues, and also how trans kids feel these days living in a society where they're being put in this legislative spotlight and seemingly used as political pawns.
I've been interviewing a lot of trans youth, and some of them are as much as possible just sticking their heads in the sand, and
Mm,
I support them in that. It's like if pretending it isn't happening is going to get you through, then do it.
right.
One of the things I found, like when I did interviews, like there's a difference between the interviews I did for my 2018 book. And I'd done those interviews right before the first Trump presidency. I'd finished those interviews. And one of the things that makes me like, I think I'm a good interviewer. And one of the things that makes me a good interviewer is I really listen, like deep listening, you know? So partly because, you know, my main priority whenever I interview a trans kid or a trans youth is that they have an okay experience.
Mhm.
Nothing about the experience makes them feel icky or, you know, makes them regret it. So that means that I won't ask certain questions or I'll just completely abandon a line of discussion because it's not where they want to be. You know, like I really let them lead. But in these more recent interviews, I found myself doing more talking than normal.
Mm.
And I realize it's because I've been really determined to give them a sense of hope. And one of the things I do is I give them a history lesson. I say, I was born in 1962. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I would be able to live the way that I do, which is to be me, you know, to
Mhm.
be queer, to be trans, to like be treated with respect, to have a good job, like, you know, to like never did I ever imagine, you know, when I was like a child, a young person that this would ever be possible. And, you know, I tell trans kids that social movements like queer and trans social movements have dealt with things much worse than this. And we made it, you know, we were successful and we can do it again. It's like we're experiencing huge backlash. You know, this is terrible what's happening right now, but we've done it before. We've already, you know, it took us a while, but we've accomplished so much. And yes, conservative politicians and groups are trying to push us back out of public life, but we managed to push our way into it.
Mhm.
And you know, it's really interesting. I ran into an interview with RuPaul in 2013, and it was on TikTok. And he was saying that the reason there's so much openness, and this is 2013, his show's really popular. I mean, some people say the trans tipping point was 2015, but you know, things were getting better for trans people. But one of the things that RuPaul said is that we have these openings, you know, where things open up and then they close again. And the person
Mhm.
he was talking with said, "You don't seriously believe they could close up again?" He said, "Oh, yes, because that's human history." You know, so he's sharing a theory of history, which is that you have these cycles of openness and closure. And the the openness, this is not what he said, but this is where I'm, you know, speaking up. The openness happens because everybody works hard for it.
Mhm.
So that, you know, when these moments of possibility happen, we're ready. I mean, like a really good example, and I also tell trans kids about, you know, the African American civil rights movement and the kinds of success that Black people have had in the United States and Canada under like horrific conditions. I remind them of that. And prison abolition as a movement and campaigns against police violence have an incredibly long history in the United States as well as Canada because racialized violence by the police is, you know, pretty standard practice.
Mhm.
Or violence by police against racialized people. Like these movements have been long standing, but in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, and all of a sudden, it's like a bunch of white people who hadn't really recognized police violence, all of a sudden were going, "Oh my god, this is real." And all of a sudden, you had mainstream conversations about defunding the police, which would have been unthinkable, and we've experienced backlash to that, but because prison abolitionists and, you know, anti-police violence groups had been working so long, they were ready for the moment. And we have to be ready for the moment. We have to keep working with the understanding that, we're in a period of, like, incredible backlash and that, you know, fascist politicians are opportunistically using hatred against trans people, hatred against immigrants, you know, racialized immigrants, etc., to mobilize a political base and seize and hold on to state power. That's happening right now. We need to resist it, but we also need to be playing the long game because, you know, there will be opportunities to push harder again, and we just have to be ready.
Mhm. Well, I like that idea of giving people hope throughout that because as you go through these ebbs and flows, it's really easy to give up and say, okay, well, maybe it's not worth it. And what I've experienced in transitioning is there's not a single difficult thing that I've gone through since transitioning that's made me regret going that path. Um, and things could get so much worse, and I still won't regret it. That's not to say that we want things to get worse, but it's good to keep people's hope throughout those periods because things will get better and we need to be there for it and we need to be working to get there. And with regard to that and with regard to politics, when politicians or pundits debate trans youth participation in sports or access to care, what nuances do you think get lost and how can we bring those voices back to the center? Because obviously we have people that are losing hope, that are maybe not doing that advocacy that they used to do. They're burning out. Those voices are then being lost. They're maybe being replaced with new voices. Maybe there's a way to inspire them to get back involved again. But how do we bring those voices back to the center, do you think?
Well, I think that we really need to build trans community and, pour our resources into each other because we're in the fight of our lives.
Hmm.
I think for me, it's maybe a little bit easier to manage because, like, one of my first memories is the assassination of Martin Luther King. Like, I came of age in a political moment where feminism, where anti-racism, where like LGBT rights were sort of starting to come up. So for me, the idea that it's going to be a fight isn't really that scary.
Right. It's always been a fight.
It's always been a fight. And I've been so deeply inspired. I mean, when I was in high school, I had two topics that I was obsessed with. One was the Black Civil Rights Movement, and the other was like the Holocaust. It's like, like the forces of evil are really very, very strong. But, the people who I value are those who stand up against them. And I've always wanted to be one of those people. But I think that having, seen it, I mean, the anti-war movements, like I grew up with the expectation that, the world was going to be a juster place, than is happening right now. And I'm just determined to go down swinging.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that everybody has to do that, but because for some trans people, like, their job is to stay alive.
Hmm.
Just stay alive, but I do think that the more that we pour into each other, the stronger that we'll be.
Yeah. Well, and you talked about growing up in that, era of feminism and anti-racism, and we've discussed previously how all of these issues are intersectional. And when it comes to supporting trans kids, you have to think about things like race, disability, faith, socioeconomic status. And as you look at how those issues all intersect, what are some tangible ways that you think we can acknowledge that complexity and advocate on behalf of all of these groups?
I it's hard because you can't do everything,
Right.
but when you do something, you need to do everybody. Like, so if I'm like, I've decided, for example, that my priority, in, activism and media work is trans kids. That's where my expertise is, and that's where I'm doubling down. I mean, I also do research on trans participation policies in sport, and I speak out about those as well, and female eligibility policies because, they're so damaging to everybody. But, I don't try to do everything, but when I do talk about trans kids, I try to talk about all trans kids. Like, I start by telling people the majority of trans kids are invisible, but, trans kids are undocumented. They're in racialized immigrant communities. They're in the homes of conservatives.
Hmm.
You know, they're everywhere. So to try to advocate for environments that support children more generally is sort of my way. Like, let's just focus on that. And I mean, sometimes it's really helpful. Like, I think about, we've got this ongoing genocide in Gaza, which is just gut-wrenchingly horrible. And that's a genocide that we're more aware of, because there are other genocidal movements in other parts of the world. But, I keep thinking, how do we have different conversations. Like the conversation that I would like to have about Israel and Palestine is, what do we need to do to ensure that every child in the region survives and thrives?
Mhm.
Let's ask that question. Like,
Right.
if we were to ask that question and we were to devote resources to addressing the well-being of every single child in the region, that would be a much better approach.
Right. Well, and that's such a difficult conversation to have, and I guess that, that's the case with any of these discussions, but you're having a conversation that ultimately people are gonna try to twist into, do you support Netanyahu or do you support Hamas? And that's not the conversation at all. The conversation is, how do you support the people? And how do you support these kids that are being put into harmful situations? And that's ultimately going to be the challenge in any of these situations, is how do you get past that political rhetoric and get down to actually supporting the people?
Yeah, and I mean, also, like, I think that it is unimaginable for people who aren't Jewish to have this legacy of being, exterminated. Like, the level of trauma. So, you're not gonna get, like, a lot of buy-in from Jewish people if they're not equally convinced that we want their kids to be okay too.
Right.
Like the fearfulness that, a lot of sensitivity needs to go into that, but like literally, like let's change the conversation. Let's keep every kid alive. Like how about doing that? 'Cause,
Right.
that is possible. That is absolutely possible. And
Mhm.
that should be our priority. Obviously it isn't, but that would be my priority to try to keep that in mind all the time, that no one is disposable.
Mhm.
In fairness, like I actually do think some people are disposable. Like, they're hateful transphobes. Like, I'm not quite Buddhist, where you wish that you're, the person who is causing you so much misery that if they were, that you wish them to be happy and well. I understand the logic, like if everyone is doing well, then, they won't need to be harmful to other people. But I think there's a certain entitled strata of people who, seem to be doing quite fine and seem to be doing quite well dehumanizing everybody else. So I'm not like achieving the peak level of prison abolition in that way. But if we justify, systemic violence against any group, we're gonna lose.
Yeah, well, and that's a tricky conversation to have, because I wanna say violence is never okay. And at the same time, there's people in this world that are always going to be violent. And the only way that you can deal with a violent individual is to defend yourself against them. And that often requires violence. So, there is no getting rid of violence until you get rid of violent individuals, but there's no getting rid of violent individuals. So there's always going to be some level of violence that I guess gets justified. But I just wish that we lived in a world where people didn't solve their issues with violence.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I'm not like a pacifist in all circumstances at all. Like, at all. Like, I know that there would be circumstances where I would engage in violence to protect the people that I loved.
Mhm.
I would hope that I would try really hard to find other ways first. But, how to dismantle this system of racial capitalism that is destroying the planet and so many people on it is like, it's very daunting, but I guess that's why you just try to deal with what's in front of you in the moment,
Mhm.
such a way that it doesn't perpetuate violence against other people. It's really complicated.
Mhm. Well, with that sort of heavy topic in our minds, and as we sort of approach the end of this podcast, I'm curious to know, amid the backlash, you talked about trying to promote hope and give kids a sense of hope. How are or where are you finding signs of progress or resilience for trans and non-binary youth right now?
I think that, P-Flag and, there's a woman in Texas named Mandy Giles who started Parents of Transgender Youth, and she's a cisgender, white woman, and she's out there speaking at legislatures on behalf of trans youth. And some of the parents I've interviewed, the kids that I've interviewed, just the determination to support trans kids and trans people. I mean, there are a lot of people who want trans kids to thrive.
Mhm.
like the backlash is huge. We're seeing it the way that it's playing out in uh, you know, like the way in which cisgender girls and women are being harassed if they're considered to be too tall or they have short hair or, some of the discourse around some of the women in the WNBA, it just like it corrodes my soul, the hatred
Mhm.
of, women who are tough. I mean, I love those women. Like, those are my favorite kind of women. I love, like enormous, really powerful women. And the hatred that is being directed at them, like it kills me. But the WNBA, I mean, we're seeing the WNBA be a site of this gender and racial conflict in ways that are really disturbing. But also, the fact that it's a place of empowerment, for gender nonconforming women, in spite of the fact that, those aren't the ones who are being marketed. But like there are so many masculine women in the WNBA who are loved by their fan base. And it's just a reminder that, of how absolutely stunningly beautiful gender nonconforming and trans people are. I mean, I have always, always loved gender nonconforming people the most. I've always, like, oh my God, like men who are really effeminate, I just love them. Like it's just and women who are like, really butch, I think it's just because it makes me feel like there's a place for me and that, I feel seen, but it's the world I want to live in. Like, so, the fact that I can find it, that I see it, that I experience it, where I did not growing up, like to me, it's like oxygen.
Mhm. Well, and I agree with you too because it feels when you're growing up in a society that's telling you this is how you behave and you adhere to these genders, to see someone just break the mold and say, "No, I'm gonna be a little bit over here, a little bit over there," and it gives you that freedom to explore your own reality and say, "Well, maybe I don't have to adhere to these, rules that feel like they've been imposed on me either." And I'm glad you brought up that point. Is there anything else, before we start to wrap things up that you'd like to share that we haven't touched on throughout this conversation?
Just to follow up, like I hear from people that I've inspired them. Like I'll have students who'll come and tell me, they'll come out as trans and they'll say, "I didn't think it was possible till I saw you doing it." Like I'm just like a very public trans person who's interested in a lot of different issues, but the fact that I seem to be like living a good life is, I've definitely heard from people. So, even when we don't know that we're inspiring other people, we are. Like, we don't always hear from them, but I think that, those of us who feel safe and confident to be visible and outspoken, I feel like it has great value.
And I mean, when it comes to that, it can be the simplest things too. I've had people that have told me I put out a video 10 years ago that made them feel comfortable being trans, and I go, that's incredible. I didn't even think about. I haven't thought about that video in since I made it, and yet it's somehow resonated with you and lasted with you. And I know that that happens in so many aspects of life, and you being an educator and being so open, you reach so many people. I'm sure you've had a huge impact on tons of people's lives, and that's incredible. And I hope more people can feel that impact from hearing from you today. And what is your hope for the future, whether that's just the future in general or the future of trans kids or your own personal future?
My hope is that, those of us who want a society that is fairer, more just, less violent, really keep doing it. And I think that that's the most important thing. It's like, take inspiration from history. Impossible things have been changed. I remind myself of that. And there's also, things can be unpredictable. I remember, in January, I was at a research team meeting and someone, I don't know how Polyev, the former leader, opposition leader, um,
Mhm.
was going to get elected with a majority. And I remember saying at that meeting, I said, not necessarily. Something could happen. And, a few of the people in the group kinda like, "You you're deluding yourself." But
Mhm.
it did.
It
It
did.
did. Like, I had no idea that it would, but I hope. I didn't really know what else to hope for other than that, he would lose the election. But things happen. So, Trump doing all these tariffs, all of a sudden, people in Canada went, we are not down with this Trump business. And Polyev had like dug himself a pit. I mean,
Hmm.
he's still got a lot of support, which is really disturbing. But no one expected, well, some people expected the pandemic, but like you can't pick the moment when something new happens. Like George Floyd was one of thousands and thousands of victims of police brutality. Why did his killing provide that specific spark? I don't know. But that's why there's always hope. Like the Berlin Wall fell down. Like I never expected to see that in my lifetime. So you just have to remind yourself that you just keep striving and keep trying to, have better relationships with the people in your life that you're interacting with and, be ready when the opportunity comes.
Right. The next big change is on the horizon. And what can our audience do to help support trans kids and create that better future that you're hoping to see?
Get into local governance
Hmm. Yeah, it keeps
and
going back to that.
get into local governance, find ways to support vulnerable children in your community. Like to me, those are the priorities. But, and like I said, I mean, not everybody wants to get into local governance, but you can find ways to support vulnerable children in your community. Like there is never a shortage of vulnerable children in your community. And that is like one of the most meaningful things that you can do.
Hmm. Well, and getting into local governance, I think, doesn't necessarily mean you're running in an
No.
election. It could mean you're supporting a candidate. It could mean that you're going to a city council meeting and you're speaking up. And there's actually a really inspiring group of people locally where I am at the school of Charles Best. They have a social justice teacher, and they've achieved so many things just by going to council and speaking. They've helped to get us a pride in Kwikwetlem. They've helped to get menstrual products in local washrooms. And all of these changes are just getting involved in local politics, like you mentioned. So that is a huge thing that people can do, and I appreciate you saying that. I also appreciate you being on the podcast, taking the time to have this conversation. I think people can learn a lot from what you have to say, and I hope that they found this inspiring. Where can people find out more about you or reach out to you?
You can Google Travers, SFU. You'll find me on the university department's webpage. You can buy my book, The Trans Generation: How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution, obviously published in days when things were more hopeful. But, like the fact that we were even capable of doing it to the extent that we were means that, we're not gonna slide back that far. I have to believe that.
Right. Well, thank you again. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I've been joined by Travers for a conversation about trans kids. You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, brought to you by NES Design and Construction, and hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.